I'm Justin Moss, here to help you get ready for Florida Grand Opera's upcoming performances of Mozart's masterpiece, The Marriage of Figaro. A number of years ago, when we were producing this opera, I came into the lobby of the Opera House and I heard a young man pass by with his girlfriend, and he turned to her and said, "I can't wait for the guy to sing Figaro, Figaro, Figaro." And I thought, geez, guy, you're at the wrong opera. But how to make someone understand where this fits in is not an easy assignment. I'm going to try, though, and I will either complicate your understanding hopelessly or give you a better sense of where this opera comes from and what all of that means. Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, is based on one of three plays written by Caron de Beaumarchais, a French playwright at the time of the American Revolution. A word about Beaumarchais. This was an exceptional guy. His father was a clockmaker, and at the age of 19, he invented a new escapement mechanism that enabled someone to build a watch much, much smaller than ever before, and one that was actually much more accurate than any of its predecessors. Watches had been pretty much a fashion statement up till that point, but this was a remarkable leap forward, and people were absolutely astonished that a 19-year-old kid could come up with such an idea. It was so impressive, he was taken to Louis XV's watchmaker at Versailles, and the watchmaker was so impressed that, as an example of how little things have really changed, the very next morning he showed up at the patent office in Paris to file a patent for this new escape mechanism under his own name. Beaumarchais challenged him and prevailed in court, humiliating the king's watchmaker, and he lost his position. Beaumarchais replaced him and not only served as the king's clockmaker, but gave harp lessons to Louis XV's daughter. During the American Civil War, Beaumarchais raised money for the American troops, and many people say that several of the key victories of the Revolutionary War were due to his having armed the soldiers at his own personal expense. It was an arrangement that was supposed to result in him being repaid. He never was, though. But those expenditures and his supplying of armaments really, in many ways, was responsible for the success of the American Revolution. As the French Revolution was approaching, though, he began to write plays that were considered dangerous by the established regime. He had an issue with the whole concept of inherited nobility, and for those of you who know the wonderful film, I think with Ronald Colman, of Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, it opens with a terrible scene of aristocrats speeding in a carriage, running over a child, and when the parent of the child comes out to confront them, he's beaten half to death for his troubles. This is the world that people lived in at this time, and Beaumarchais tried to illustrate in this first play, The Barber of Seville, and its successor, the sequel, if you will, The Marriage of Figaro, these ideas as being unacceptable, really. In The Barber of Seville, which was the first of his plays, we have Count Almaviva coming into town and being aided by Figaro, a man who's not only a barber but a marriage broker, a counselor, a realtor, and whatnot, probably a decorator as well. And Figaro helps the Count Almaviva steal away the beautiful young and wealthy Rosina from her elderly steward, Dr. Bartolo. It's a great love story, and off they go to live happily ever after, so we think. The next play that Beaumarchais writes, though, is The Marriage of Figaro. We're several years further along at this point in time, and Figaro has become Count Almaviva's valet. The Count has married Rosina. She is now the Countess Almaviva, and she has a maid by the name of Susanna. Figaro and Susanna are to be married on the day that the play opens. And in fact, all of the action of this play occurs on one day, and a very complicated day it is. Things have not gone quite as happily as everyone did project, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But the third play in the trilogy is La Mère Coupable, The Guilty Mother. And although this has been the least popular of the three plays, it was the inspiration for Corigliano's The Ghosts of Versailles, which premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in 1991. Now, the guy singing Figaro, 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 this is actually from Rossini's opera based on the first of Beaumarchais' play, The Barber of Seville. It, however, was written after Mozart's essay of the second play, The Marriage of Figaro. So there's a little chart we're going to bring up right now for you to look at, and I hope that that will help clarify some of this for you. At the top of the chart, we have the dates of the three plays of Beaumarchais, 1773 through 1792, but The Marriage of Figaro being right in the middle, written in 1778. Giovanni Paisiello, who was a contemporary of Mozart, actually maybe a generation older, but they were alive and working at the same time, had written an opera in 1782 based on the first play of Beaumarchais, The Barber of Seville. It had become immensely popular and was widely known, produced all over Europe, and really had made Paisiello's name. Mozart comes along, though, a kid, very, very precocious kid who had already developed a Europe-wide reputation as one who could sit at a keyboard and repeat an incredibly complicated, long piece of music he had just heard played by a composer for the first time. He could sit down and just note perfect repeat that thing. An intellect and a skill like no one else's at the time or since, in fact. Paisiello had written his opera that had become very, very popular, and later we're going to have Rossini in 1816 have the cheek to write his own opera based on this play, The Barber of Seville. Paisiello's opera was so popular and he was so beloved by the public that people were incensed, really, that Rossini would have the audacity to do this, but he said, let me go ahead, and he initially called it by another name, but it later became known as The Barber of Seville, the same title. And Rossini's opera, of course, gathered steam and became one of the most popular operas in the repertory. It is there that when Figaro introduces himself in the opera, he calls out his name serially, imitating how the crowds of people all over Seville need him for this errand, for that favor, for this advice, and everywhere he turns he hears Figaro, 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 people calling his name. He says, how can I be everywhere at once? So this poor young man coming to Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, was expecting to hear the earlier installment, The Barber of Seville, and Figaro's great Entrada, or introduction aria, known as the Largo al Factotum, the Song of the Servant. I hope that's perfectly clear to you. At least I hope it helps a little bit to understand where these things come from. The Marriage of Figaro is considered by many scholars and musicologists to be perhaps Mozart's great masterpiece. He undertook a project to create a work so vividly new, so bewilderingly brilliant in its complexity, the use of great musical ensembles as well as gloriously rich arias, solos for each of the characters in this piece. And of course the play was famous for its immense complications. Mozart came up with the idea of creating an opera based on this play, which had become wildly popular, although forbidden from performance in many places in Europe for its subversive nature. Mozart approached Lorenzo da Ponte, a librettist, a man of letters, with the play and said, what do you think of making a libretto from this play in Italian for me to set to music and create an opera? It was said that da Ponte created the libretto in 6 weeks, came back to Mozart. He had to get approval from the court in Vienna because the play had been forbidden to be produced there because of its subversive nature, and da Ponte was able to sort of pare away the most radical speeches and incidents from the play to pass the censors' possible objections and slip it by. So the libretto was approved before Mozart started writing the music. People loved the opera, and it gathered steam as people came to understand it better. And in fact, because of its great difficulty and complexity, the first performance was probably not the smoothest essay of the score ever to be witnessed by the public. By the sixth performance, though, it was going wondrously well, and people realized that this was a masterpiece like nothing else that had come along. This has been regularly one of the most popular operas in the world. It may have had a dip in popularity probably in the late 1800s. We saw performances of it given with Mozart's music in different texts, different librettos, for reasons not entirely clear to anyone who was in attendance at these really distorted and bastardized productions. But I think a new appreciation came about in the early 1900s, especially with Gustav Mahler being the chief conductor at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, championing these works as some of the most magnificent ever created. The story in Mozart's opera occurs on the estate of the Count Almaviva, just outside of Seville. Figaro, whom we came to know in the earlier play, The Barber of Seville, Figaro is measuring off a room that has been assigned in the palace to him and Susanna, whom he plans to marry that very day. He's pacing off the floor, measuring it for the bed and counting. Susanna is trying on a wedding bonnet that she plans to wear. And Figaro is remarking about how perfectly situated this room is, equidistant between the Countess's bedroom and the Count's room. And as he remarks on the convenience of this, when one is needed by the other, the servants can run quickly to their masters and take care of whatever the issue may be. And Susanna is less enthusiastic about this, and she remarks to her husband-to-be that convenient, yes indeed, especially for the Count, because when Figaro is off doing something, she'll be virtually within his grasp, and he's been chasing her and given her a lot of cause for concern. One of the key and central issues about both the play and Mozart's opera is the old practice of droit du seigneur, the right of the lord. And this was a medieval practice by which the lord of the manor had the privilege of sleeping with all the young women on their wedding nights on his estate before the brides could themselves. And it was a practice that was hated, as you can well imagine. And after his marriage to Rosina, now the Countess Almaviva, the Count had pronounced he was suspending this old practice that was so hated by his servants. Now, however, he has made plans to reinstate the practice and exercise it with Susanna on the very night of her wedding. Figaro is determined to see that this will not, in fact, take place, however. And he gets furious when Susanna tells him of the Count's intentions, and left alone for a moment, he sings a little aria about the Count wanting to dance, and if that's the case, Figaro, and not the Count, will call the tune. And he plans from the outset to thwart the Count's ambitions for his bride-to-be. We have an entrance of two characters, elderly people, Dr. Bartolo, a lawyer, and his old housekeeper, Marcellina. She has an issue in that some years ago, Figaro had borrowed a sum of money from her, and the loan contract stated that if he was unable to repay her by a certain date, he would marry her. He has, of course, been unable to repay her, and Bartolo, still angry with Figaro for having helped whisk Rosina out from under him, has come to have his revenge by forcing Figaro to either pay up for the loan or marry Marcellina. It's going to be a showdown, and it's going to be a lot of trouble, but Bartolo exits, leaving Susanna and Marcellina alone for a moment. The two have a charming scene of exchanging insults with one another. It's clear there's no love lost between them. And when Susanna congratulates Marcellina on her astonishing achievement of the age she has attained, Marcellina stomps off in a bit of a rage, leaving Susanna alone. The Count comes in, finding Susanna unattended, and he's a little concerned because he wants to seek his way with her. Now, unbeknownst to the Count, Cherubino had come in to speak quietly with Susanna to implore her assistance in an issue. Cherubino, which is a trouser role, a young male, an adolescent, sung by a mezzo-soprano. Cherubino is the page in the palace, and he has just discovered women and other things probably too, but he's been going crazy chasing women throughout the palace. He'd been caught with the servant girl Barbarina by the Count, and the Count had given him a very hard time, and he'd come to plead with Susanna to speak to the Countess to see if the Count would go easy on him and not subject him to some really terrible punishment. In the middle of his implications, though, suddenly they heard a noise. It was the Count coming. Cherubino is hidden very quickly in Susanna's room. The Count comes in, finds himself alone with Susanna, and decides that he will make a play for her. When clearly he sees she's not interested in him as an affectionate proposition, he offers her money, in fact. And of course, all of this, unbeknownst to the Count, is being overheard by Cherubino from his hiding place. And they hear a noise of someone approaching, and the Count, not wanting to be caught alone with Susanna in her room, seeks a hiding place himself. Now both Cherubino and the Count are hiding in Susanna's bedroom when Don Basilio, the music teacher, comes in with a nice piece of gossip, and that is that Cherubino seems to have fallen wildly in love with the Countess, the lady of the manor, if you will, and that this is sure to cause a big scene when the Count finds out about it. The Count overhears this, of course, springs from his hiding place, denounces Cherubino for all of his pursuit of the women in the palace, and then goes on to describe how he had come upon Cherubino alone with Barbarina, behaving inappropriately, and that the two of them were in the room, and he knew that they were trying to hide. And he says, I went over to the table, and there was a cloth thereon, and I reached down and I picked it up. And as he does so, to illustrate his discovery of Cherubino, there once again is Cherubino in hiding. The Count is furious with Cherubino and is about to literally jump on him when Cherubino reminds him that he overheard all of his talk with Susanna and even the offer of cash money, and the Count decides he'd be prudent to back down at this point. The day is saved by the arrival of Figaro with a group of peasants to sing some songs in anticipation of the wedding. Figaro tries to position the Count to force him to declare that he will continue the suspension of the droit de seigneur, but the Count delays this by saying he will, but only later after other business has been attended to. Poor Cherubino is downcast. The Count turns to him and, rather than severely punish him, decides he will send him off to Seville to join his regiment that the Count maintains there. He'll be joining the army, in fact. Cherubino is downcast, but he's cheered up by Figaro, who sings a mocking little aria to him, beginning with words, Non più andrai, no more flitting around the palace, chasing girls like a lovesick butterfly. You're off to glory, marching through the mud, vigor, danger, fighting, and all for very, very little money. The second act opens with the Countess alone in her chambers, and she sings a beautiful and very sad aria, beginning with the words Porgi amor. She calls out to the gods of love to restore the affection from the Count that she feels she has completely lost. It's a miserable, miserable little tune, and we can understand and identify with the Countess's heartbreak at this time. Susanna comes in to try to comfort her by saying that, the Count wasn't really in love with her. He was in fact offering her money for sex. This doesn't actually bring the Countess to the place I think Susanna was desiring of. But nonetheless, this attempt to comfort the Countess is pretty much thwarted at this point. Figaro shows up, joins in a plot with the Countess and Susanna to try to somehow trip up the Count, to show him up for the cad that he is, and to disgrace him in a way. Figaro recommends that they might do well by dressing Cherubino up as a girl. He hasn't yet left the palace, and if they dress him up as a girl and set a trap, they can certainly fool the Count, expose his philandering ways, and embarrass him in such a manner. And it sounds like a pretty good plan, so Susanna and the Countess decide they will undertake it. Figaro goes off. The Countess and Susanna find some women's clothes, dress Cherubino up in them, and they try to tutor him in how to move, walk, and behave like a woman so that he can actually be successful in this. Susanna thinks that she has in her room a ribbon that would be the master stroke of finishing off Cherubino's costume. She runs down the hall to retrieve it, leaving the Countess and Cherubino alone. The Countess has very carefully locked the doors so that they won't be surprised in their getting Cherubino all fixed up in his female costume. And they hear an approach coming down the hall, and it is in fact the Count. He comes upon the locked door of the Countess's room, which is unusual, and he calls out for her. Desperate and fearful of being caught, the Countess throws Cherubino into her closet. Cherubino locks the door of the closet from the inside, and finally the Countess pulls herself together and goes over, unlocks her door to admit her husband. He comes in and sees that she's both out of breath and obviously distracted, and he questions her about what could possibly be wrong, and she says absolutely nothing, that she's just fine. And as the Count is talking to her, Cherubino in the closet knocks something over and creates a huge loud sound, which is shocking in fact. And the Count turns to the Countess and says, "What was that?" And the Countess replies, "What?" And she's pretending that she didn't hear anything, which is of course impossible. And the Countess says, "Who is in this closet?" And the Countess says, "It's only Susanna. She was trying on her wedding dress and didn't want to be seen in it, so when you approached, she hid in the closet very quickly." The Count demands that Susanna come out of the closet. The Countess demands that Susanna stay right where she is. The Count says, "Well then speak to me, Susanna. Identify yourself by your voice." And the Countess yells out, "Be quiet. Don't utter a word, Susanna." So we're in a terrible standoff. The closet is locked. The Count can't get in. He thinks it's Cherubino in the closet. The Countess is telling him it's Susanna. And he decides to resolve this by taking the Countess with him to fetch tools to force the closet door, and that he will lock the Countess's room behind them so there will be no shenanigans of any kind. In the meantime, during all of this commotion, Susanna has returned to the room with the ribbon unseen by the Count and the Countess, and she's hidden behind a big piece of furniture. The minute the Count takes the Countess out to go for tools, Cherubino comes out of the closet. Susanna says, "Come out, come out, come out, get out of here." They can't go out through the doors, which have been locked, so Susanna ends up throwing poor Cherubino out the window down to the second story into the garden, and Susanna then herself goes into the closet and locks it behind her. Now the Count and Countess return, and the Countess believes she is trapped. She believes Cherubino still to be in the closet, and that there's going to be real hell to pay. She finally turns to the Count and makes a great confession that in fact she had lied to him, and it is Cherubino in the closet. He grows furious, draws his sword, and demands, "I'm coming in to kill you!" And the closet door opens, and Susanna bursts out. And it's hard to know who is more astonished, the Count or the Countess. The Countess tells her husband she was just testing him to see how much he really trusted her after all. The Count isn't really buying it initially, and then they're surprised by the gardener, Antonio, who shows up with a broken flower pot to complain about someone having just gone through that window. The Count, of course, grows very suspicious. Figaro comes upon the scene, sees what's going on, and claims that it was he himself who had jumped and leapt from the window. And the Count doesn't believe it, but after a lot of machinations and a very escalated degree of consternation on the Count's part, Figaro managed to talk his way out of it, and not a moment too soon. As soon as Figaro believes he has proved that he was in fact the jumper, to the only marginal satisfaction of the Count, we have Marcellina and the Dons Bartolo and Basilio enter with that loan contract demanding satisfaction or an immediate marriage of Figaro to Marcellina. The Count sees an opportunity to delay the proceedings, though, giving him more time to pursue Susanna, and so he says, we'll just hold this in abeyance until I've had an opportunity to thoroughly investigate and adjudicate the situation. In the next scene, the Count is mulling the situation he's found himself in. He's not happy. He feels that there are things afoot that he hasn't fully been able to understand or get his arms around. And Susanna comes upon him, and she confesses that she's been a little harsh with him in rejecting his advances, but tells him that she would be open to an assignation and establishing a little rendezvous. The Count thanks her profusely for finally seeing the light of day and making him virtually the happiest man on earth, etc., etc. And as Susanna takes her leave, she passes Figaro in the hallway, and as she passes Figaro, the Count hears her say to him, "Hai già vinta la causa." The case is already won. This gives the Count pause, obviously, and he repeats those words as he begins his famous aria. Hai già vinta la causa. What can she mean by that? The case is already won. He senses a trap, and he sings his famous aria in which he, brimming with indignation and privilege, indignantly calls out, "How can my servant enjoy his life while I suffer for want," basically for want of his bride-to-be. And in this great aria we can sense him dripping with the whole bullying nature of his entitlement, and this is a part of the whole concept of the class war that Beaumarchais is trying to underscore as we're in the run-up to the French Revolution at this point in time. Finishing his aria, the Count purposes that he's going to punish Figaro by forcing him to marry Marcellina, who in fact is old enough to be Figaro's mother. We now go into the judgment scene. All the evidence has been heard, and the Count decides that in fact Figaro is unable to pay Marcellina the loan, and he will have to marry her. Figaro though protests and says, "I can't get married without the permission from my parents. And as my parents are unknown, it's impossible for me to marry." This escalates into a great lively discussion among the parties involved until it is finally discovered that in fact Marcellina is not only old enough to be Figaro's mother, she is his mother. And it's discovered that Figaro is the love child of Marcellina when she was the housekeeper for Bartolo, and he'd been put up for adoption as a child, never knew who his real parents were, but Marcellina has been able to identify that he is in fact her son by a birthmark on his arm in the shape of a spatula. They're happily reunited. Susanna comes in the room only to find Figaro hugging his mother enthusiastically. Susanna doesn't know that he's discovered that she is his mother, thinks that he's perhaps abandoning her to marry Marcellina, and slaps Figaro, but a great scene of reunification occurs, and Bartolo generously announces that he will finally, after all of these years, marry Marcellina in a double ceremony along with Susanna and Figaro on that very evening. The next scene finds the Countess alone by herself, and she's really feeling abandoned at this point. She sings the famous aria, "Dove sono?" Where have they gone? Those beautiful moments together that we knew when we were first in love. She's absolutely desperate, and it's a gorgeous and justifiably famous aria that she sings about her widowed heart, really, her complete abandonment by her husband. Susanna comes in, and together they decide they will set a trap once and for all to show the Count off for exactly who he is. There's a beautiful duet that they sing as they compose a letter that Susanna is going to slip to the Count, offering a rendezvous in the garden that very night. The letter is prepared and Susanna seals it with a little brooch. She uses the pin on that brooch to seal the letter, and so the plot is now set into motion. As a celebration for the wedding occurs, the ceremony has just taken place, the two couples have been married, Susanna takes the opportunity to slip the note to the Count. This is seen by Figaro, who suddenly has a wave of jealousy overcome him, which is only moderated by his witnessing the Count prick his finger with the pin on the brooch. And in a bit of schadenfreude, he decides, well, perhaps things aren't as bad as they seem. I saw Susanna pass him the note, but I'm taking great joy in seeing the Count prick his finger on the pin, and probably the only drop of blood shed in this whole opera, which is uncommon for an opera, to tell the truth. Later, Figaro and his mother are passing through the garden, and they come upon the servant girl Barbarina. She has actually been dispatched to return the brooch and the pin to Susanna as a signal from the Count that he's accepted her invitation for the rendezvous, as Susanna had instructed him in her note. But in the dark, she's dropped the pin. She's down on her hands and knees looking for it. When they come upon it, Figaro sees that it is Susanna's pin, and he suddenly realizes the enormity of the situation. He's just been married to Susanna, and she has given the Count a note offering to have a tryst with him in the garden that very night. He says to his mother, "What will I do?" And his mother tries to calm him down, saying, "This must be something that we're not understanding. Let me go and speak to Susanna." She leaves Figaro alone, and he sings his famous aria beginning with the words "Aprite, aprite." He walks right downstage and addresses the gentlemen in the theater, saying, "Open your eyes, men. Look what these women are doing to you. They are evil comets that stream into our lives, causing immense sorrow and disruption." And he goes on to catalog all the terrible things that women do to men. And then he completes the phrase with the words, il resto non dico. The rest I won't even tell you. It's already too well known. It's a magnificent aria, and it actually was written by Mozart to replace a very highly charged political speech that Figaro delivers in the play against the entitlement of inherited nobility. This would never pass the censor, so instead he has Figaro delivering an invective against unfaithful women and the pain and grief that they cause men. It's a famous aria, and when really well performed, it's usually a very exciting highlight of the evening. The opera concludes in the garden as night is falling. Susanna and the Countess have exchanged costumes, so Susanna appears to be the Countess, and the Countess appears to be Susanna. Susanna hides in the shrubbery and sings a seductive aria, hoping to attract the Count. He comes along and sees her, but at the last minute, Susanna exchanges places with the Countess, and the Countess, wearing Susanna's clothes, is taken by the Count to be Susanna. He begins to make overtures, indecent proposals, in fact, to her, slips a golden ring on her finger, and the Countess wanders further off into the brush a little more deeply. The Count pursues her and then loses her briefly for a while. Figaro comes into the scene. He sees whom he believes to be the Countess, and he goes to complain to her about Susanna being unfaithful to him with the Countess's husband. And as Susanna, in the Countess's clothing, replies, Figaro recognizes her voice. He goes along with her, though, playing with her to tease her and torment her, until finally Susanna loses her patience, finding him indecent, and slaps him. And he says, "Susanna, Susanna, my dear, I knew it was you from your voice from the very, very first." Eventually, the Count finds whom he believes to be Susanna. Figaro is found with whom the Count believes to be his wife, when it is in fact actually Susanna. He calls for the servants, thinking that he's got Figaro compromised. The servants come with torches, and it's then revealed that Figaro is caught in the dark with his wife, Susanna, and that the woman the Count was chasing through the brush, believing to be Susanna, was his wife, the Countess. And this she proves by withdrawing the ring that he believed he was giving to Susanna and returning it to him. The opera ends with the Count going down on one knee, begging for forgiveness from his wife, who magnanimously offers it up as a pardon to him. And the opera concludes with a feeling that lives have certainly been changed, but that goodness has at the end of the day prevailed. And we hope, for everything we're worth, that just maybe the Count has learned a lesson, and that some of the love that had been so rewarding to both Rosina and the young Count Almaviva can be returned to them now at this time, and that Susanna and Figaro have really proved their love for one another, and perhaps can have the life happy ever after that the Count and the Countess had seemingly been denied. Such a masterwork, though, the likes of which have never been seen again, has rightfully taken its place as one of the most amazing operas ever. Johannes Brahms was very fond of Mozart's music. He wrote to a friend once a remarkable statement about this piece that I would like to conclude with, and hope that you can keep it in mind when you come and see The Marriage of Figaro at Florida Grand Opera. For many of you, a first-time experience. Brahms wrote that, in my opinion, each number in Figaro is a miracle. It is totally beyond me how anyone create anything so perfect. Nothing like it was ever done again, not even by Beethoven. It is something you will never forget, and I hope to see you at Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro.